Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer dedicated to supporting system-centered technologies. Today's discussion will be part 5 in a series we're doing, discussing application deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today is part 5 again, but part 2 of the client experience discussion. This is a series that we've been going through. By the way, get this out of the way first, so back to the introduction. So this is a series we've been going through to show what the user experience will be like whenever they receive application deployments on the client. So this could be the user experience as they interact on the client with the deployments, or the deployments that go down without user interaction. Most of what we do in this session and the part 1 of the client experience was all user initiated, just so we can aid in demos, but either one apply. So we're going to continue that today, and we're going to use 3 specific demos: maintenance windows, talk about that, the idea of distribute on demand, and then roaming. So we're going to use these to certainly address the individual demos, but then to show some other information as well as we go along. We'll use a couple of examples to call out some points we've already talked about. Also, this is the first discussion that we are really going to take a peek at the logs and see things that happen behind the scenes. We're not going to get off in the weeds on it, but just to start to get you thinking a little bit about the pieces that happen behind the scenes to pull all of this together. Remember, we're on a long series here. The first few sessions up until now have been to introduce application deployment. There's a lot of ground to cover with that. So it has taken us 5 sessions to get here, and just starting the 5th. From here, we're going to go back to the server side and start to uncover how things work. Then we're going to end up back on the client side and see how things work. So that's kind of where we are. We're close to the middle, but we're on the client side today. All right. So again, we're going to talk about maintenance windows, the idea of distribute on demand, and roaming. So in preparation for our roaming discussion, and I'll certainly go over this again as we get into the discussion, I have an example of my lab right here. So I have one client I'll be using for the demo. Okay. This client will be shifting IP addresses as I do the demo. So this is the home site. This is the site where the client's assigned. So we'll start here, and it will be on this IP address, and I have one boundary group that encompasses this IP address and one distribution point. So we'll be able to see what it's like when the client's within the boundary group of its assigned site, or boundaries of its assigned site, retrieving content. We'll be able to see what happens. Then we're going to move the client to another boundary, or another IP subnet, which is going to put it into another boundary group, the boundary group of PS2. When we do that, the client's still assigned to PS1. The site assignment's not going to change, but now we'll be in the PS2 boundary, so we'll see what happens when the client tries to retrieve the content from there. Then we'll eventually put it into the boundary group of the secondary site. That's actually, this is mispositioned. I didn't really try to line this up on purpose. I just put a little grouping here. But the secondary site's a direct child of PS1, and we'll see what happens when the client roams into the boundaries of the secondary site. And then our final example will be the client roaming outside any controlled boundary. So this would be a scenario when you're attaching at a hotel room, as an example, and what the client will do there. So that's kind of our direction for where we're going to go. And roaming will definitely take some time, so we'll do it last, as we see in the diagram, and we'll start with maintenance windows. So that said, let's go ahead and pull in our lab environment and start using it for our discussion. So with maintenance windows, we have 2 scenarios, 3 demos that I want to do. So the first one is new in 2012, and it's the idea of user-centric maintenance windows, the ability to give the user a bit of control over their deployment experience. Now, the term maintenance window is used because it's pretty close, probably the closest way to describe when you're thinking about it. It's not really a maintenance window, meaning this: when the IT group decides, when the administrators decide that something needs to happen on the client at a given time, and they enforce it at that time, then it doesn't matter what the client settings are. It's going to happen. So IT always wins. Okay, but what I'm going to show you here with the user side is the idea that in those scenarios where it's possible to give the user a bit more control of their experience, we enable that. Okay, so the demo that I'm going to use for this is I have an application here called Maintenance Window User, and this is just a simple application. Doesn't have anything real special here. It just runs a batch file, so I'll just show you the deployment type real quick. So it just runs a batch file to take some action, copy a file, as it were, on the client. So here's our program. Runs a batch file to copy an executable in, has an uninstall as well, has appropriate detection logic. And again, this is pretty important, and I'll show you that as we get along. An example of what happens if you don't have this, and so on. So nothing real special in the application definition. So if I look in the deployments, I have one deployment targeted to all systems, and notice it is a required deployment. Okay. And the deployment is active right now. Okay? But if we look at the properties of it, one of the key characteristics of a deployment like this, where the user might actually be able to have some control, is if we look at the schedule, we see that it's not mandatory, meaning it's not required until 11/1/2012. So you see here it's required. You see here this is when it's absolutely must be installed. Okay, so notice also up here UTC. So you have a choice of UTC or client local time. I chose UTC, and when we get to the client, you'll see that this time is not exactly reflected in the client because of the time shift of UTC. Okay, so this is deployed. It's waiting for us on the client side. I went ahead and did the deployment so that it would be available on the client, and we can see what it looks like. So that said, let's go over and look at the client side and what this deployment looks like. So if we look on the client and look in Software Center, we see here's our deployment. And you notice that the deployment has arrived. I haven't installed it yet because I didn't want to. I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to look at it here. But you notice, as it shows up in Software Center, it's saying this is scheduled to install at 10/31/2012 at this time. Again, for the UTC drift. All right. This application is still required. It is absolutely going to be installed whenever it comes time. And depending on configuration, you, as a user, you may just see it in Software Center, or you may see pop-ups and so on outside of Software Center. Let me show you what I mean by that, just as a reminder. So if we go back to the deployment, go to Properties, and take a look at our User Experience tab, here we define that we want to basically display user notifications in Software Center and show all of them, right? Or we can hide all notifications in Software Center, or we can display in Software Center and only allow notifications for computer restarts, right? So basically what this is saying is we're going to show it in Software Center, and all of our pop-ups are going to show up. The balloon pop-ups on the client are going to show. That's the setting we have. Or you can just say display in Software Center, and the only notifications you want to show are those of a pending computer restart. Or you can hide everything. Right? So this is what we have. And so with that setting, we may actually see, depending on the way timing works out, we may or may not see some balloons show up down here indicating something's pending. Certainly, if we look here, we'll notice, as soon as I can hover over the piece, there's software changes that are required by IT. So this is definitely pending in the user's area. Okay? So if I double click it here, as I did, then we should get a pop-up here in just a sec that gives the user an interface where they can make some changes if they want to. Okay? This is the interface that enables, if you will, the user to interact with this deployment and make some decisions. Now, I can access that interface from Software Center. All I have to do is click Schedule. Okay? So here's the idea. Okay? Before I get into this, here's the idea of this. So in Software Center, a user has the ability to define working hours. So these are the defaults, 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. working days of the week. You can change that as the user, whatever your working hours are. So what this does is if there's deployments that show up like ours that are in fact required at some point in the future, then as the user, you can make a decision to say, okay, here's my business hours. I've already defined them. I really don't want to be bothered by worrying about when this application is going to install. I know, for example, maybe today, I'm really not got a whole lot going on after my working hours, so go ahead and install it. The computer will be up. I'll leave it on, whatever. Go ahead and install it after working hours. Okay? So you can make that decision. So at that time, if we were to choose that at 10 o'clock on today, then we would go ahead, the Config Manager client, and install that required application, even though it's not required for many more weeks. Okay? We'd allow the user to accelerate that, but do that acceleration in compliance so that with their business hours, so we don't disrupt them while they're working. Okay? Another option that kind of plays into this, or does play into this, is under computer maintenance. So you can choose to suspend Software Center activities while your computer is in presentation mode. Which may raise the question, what exactly is presentation mode? So we know from the setting that whenever we are in presentation mode that the activity of Software Center will be suspended, so how do we get there? So really, presentation mode is an ability on some versions of Windows 7 and on versions of Windows 7 running on laptops. So say that a bit clear. Not all versions of Windows 7 have Windows Mobility Center, and those systems that are not running on laptops tend to not have Windows Mobility Center either. But where you do have it, it's in the control panel, and there's an option in there for presentation mode, so that when you're giving a presentation, you can adjust the system settings so that you're not interrupted, and that's what this links into. Another option here is to automatically install and uninstall anything that's required, but restart the computer only during your specified business hours when they're done. Okay? So with this other option, the second one, the first one on the list, which is not enabled by default, if you do get software deployed, then we could go ahead and install it for you whenever, but only reboot the system after you have left business hours. All right? So you get all those options whenever you look at the deployment here. Let's pull up that window again. So I'll click Schedule, and notice that I have the choice, Install Software Now. So if I click OK, the software is going to run. Okay? Or I can choose to install outside of business hours. So in this case, if I selected this, then the required software, even though it's only required in a bunch of weeks from now, end of December, 1st of November, depending on the time settings, then it will go ahead and install now proactively in a way that will not disturb me because I'm not currently in business hours. I also have the ability to set this flag to restart automatically after the installation is needed rather than prompt. So it gives the user a bit more control over their environment. Okay, but again, just to restate, it does not prevent a deployment that must happen right now that IT has sent out. So if IT has an emergency deployment must happen, there's really no time to wait, then these business hours settings won't interfere with that. Okay, so that's part one. So again, kind of a user-oriented maintenance window, not exactly a true maintenance window as you'll see with our next example, but it's a good way to think about it. All right, for the second maintenance window demo, we'll move off of the user-focused stuff, which again is kind of quasi-maintenance window, and move to more the system-focused maintenance windows, which is really where true maintenance windows are defined. Again, just to restate, anything the user decides to set on their side, administrators, if we define things on our side to run, then that trumps whatever the user does. Okay? So for the second demo, I have one application which I will use for both demos, and I'll walk you through them. So the first one is basically a maintenance window in the future, and then the second is a really long run time. Again, I'll talk about those in a minute. So two we'll do here. So before we talk about the deployment or the application, let's go talk about maintenance windows themselves. So maintenance windows are defined on a collection. So you see here, I have a collection MW collection that I will be using to deploy the particular maintenance window application that I have. All right. Now, let me be clear. I'm choosing to deploy to the maintenance window collection not because that is the collection where I have my maintenance window defined, which you'll see in a minute, but for convenience. Notice that I have only one device, one system in my maintenance window collection. So it's my client that I'm targeting. So for the demos, I don't really want to set maintenance windows anywhere else. So I just want to put them on here, and I don't want my deployments for maintenance windows going to the all systems collection. I could, doesn't matter, but just for convenience, I'm targeting it here. To restate, and the other examples that you'll see me run in the lab, by the way, are basically targeted to all systems. So what that should illustrate for you right away, and if it doesn't, I'll explain it, is the collections that you use to define your maintenance windows are not necessarily the ones that you're going to need to use to deploy your content that you want to adhere to those maintenance windows. Said another way, when a device is in a collection that has a maintenance window defined, that device receives that maintenance window. And then when content is targeted to that device through any other collection, then the maintenance window is still in force. Said yet a third way. A recommendation for how you put maintenance windows in place is that you build collections that are specifically for defining maintenance windows, not for deployments. If you start putting maintenance windows on collections that are also used for deployments, you run the risk of introducing confusion. Okay? And that's really important because of the next point. If you have a collection with a maintenance window defined and a device is in that collection, okay, call it collection A. And then you have a second collection, call it collection B, with that same device in it with a second maintenance window defined, then the device gets both maintenance windows because it is in collections that define each, right? Another way to say it is maintenance windows are cumulative. It's also very possible to define multiple maintenance windows on a given collection. So just to keep things straight, it's a good idea to have collections for maintenance windows, collections for targeting your deployments. Okay? If you ever wonder what your maintenance structure is, certainly easy enough to go back in that scenario then and look at your collections, look at where your devices are, and so on. If you ever wonder, even still, that maybe you crossed the line and introduced a maintenance window into a collection intended for deployment, there are reports as well that will help you figure out where your maintenance windows are, what maintenance windows a given device has, and different ways to track that down. All right, so let's look at the maintenance window definition real quick. So if I go to Properties on my collection, here we go, then I'm going to have a tab for Maintenance Window. And on this collection, I already have a maintenance window defined. So this one, let me click on Edit for a minute. So this one is put in place for the first demo. And again, the first demo that we're going to do is, I'll save that. I'll get to that in a minute. So for this particular demo, we have a maintenance window that is not effective until way in the future. Okay? And then when it does become effective, it's going to be on a weekly schedule that it is effective. And when it opens up, when the maintenance window starts, it's going to last for a duration of 21 hours. Now, that's a very unrealistic maintenance window. Probably it is. But in my lab, I went ahead and made a really large maintenance window. I could have made it even shorter, but for the demo that I'm going to do, demo number 2, and 1, really, I need a really large maintenance window. I'll explain to you why as we get to the client side. Okay. All right. So if I click OK here, again, it's in place, already done. It's down to the client. I could add another one here if I wanted a collection with multiple maintenance windows. That's fine. So it's in place. Let's go to our deployment and take a look, or our application, take a look at what we have configured. Okay, so our system maintenance windows deployment. So if I go to properties on here, nothing really out of the ordinary and worth talking about until we get to deployment types. So for my deployment type, if I click on the user experience tab, then I have this setting for maximum allowed runtime. Okay, let me differentiate between these two real quick. So maximum allowed runtime I'll tell you about in a minute. This estimated installation time in minutes, this is something that is just for user reference, so that when the user is looking at Software Center and looking at what they're going to deploy, whatever, they'll be able to see if there is some estimate of how long it's going to take them to do that. So it is important to fill that out, but that particular setting is not used for maintenance windows. This is. Okay? So it's always a good idea, whether maintenance windows are in the picture or not, to set your various options according to what they should be instead of just letting them pass. If you don't have maintenance windows in play, the maximum allowed runtime is of less importance. Okay? The default value here is 120 minutes, so there are implications of leaving it at that value when it should be lessened. But those implications, again, are less, if you will, than if you have maintenance windows. If you have maintenance windows in place, then the setting that you have for maximum allowed runtime is critical, right? Because you have, by definition, with a maintenance window in place, you're allowing a certain amount of time for maintenance work to be done. So the implication, if you have this misconfigured, is we'll look at what our maximum allowed runtime is configured to be. And then we'll look at the maintenance window that is remaining on the client. And if we don't have enough time to do what we think we need to do based on the configuration of maximum allowed runtime, we're not going to run this deployment. So it's possible that you could either have deployments that never run because you never give them enough time to run, or that you don't get as much done during the maintenance window as you expect. Okay, so making sure these are realistic, very important. When you factor in dependencies and the fact other things may need to run first in order to get a deployment done, it could be that you don't get through an entire deployment because all these dependencies are installing and they have their own maximum runtime and so on, right? So having a realistic setting here is absolutely critical. I've put a very ridiculous setting here. I would assume it's ridiculous in most cases, just to illustrate a point. And again, that's coming up really in focus next. But 720 minutes is going to still be effective for this first demo. Okay, so that's what we have configured. Now, notice I don't have any deployments configured for this yet. And the reason why is because if I would have configured a deployment, I wouldn't be able to, I would already be past what I want to show you in the demo. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. And I'm going to target it to my collection for maintenance windows. Again, I don't have to do that. I could absolutely target it to all systems if I wanted to, and the maintenance window is still in force. But I'm just going to target it here because I just have the one client in it. Click Next. So here I'm going to add my distribution point. And next. Here I'm going to make it a required deployment. Click Next. And tell it to run as soon as possible. So I'm setting up a scenario where this deployment is going to go out. It's going to be required to execute as soon as possible, but we're not going to have any windows open for it to execute. Okay. So click Next, and then notice here I have the ability to override the maintenance window if I want to. So if this is a critical enough deployment that I want to run it regardless of what those maintenance windows are set to, that's what I can do here. But I don't want to in this case, otherwise it would kind of defeat the purpose of the sample, of the example here. So I'm going to click on Through, and then the deployment's created, and it's making its way out to the client. So let me go ahead, let me close that. Go ahead to the client side now, and we'll clear that and get Software Center back in focus. So we're going to wait, and I have that hanging around from a previous test I was doing. So I'm going to clear this in Software Center, and we're going to wait for our deployment to arrive. So to help speed things along a little bit, I'm just going to go ahead and kick a policy cycle manually. We'll probably have to wait a few minutes. I'll pause the recording while we're waiting for it to show up, and that way you don't have to just stare at a blank screen for a while. So we're waiting for that to show up, and then eventually it will show up. It shouldn't take too long, right under here. So I'll keep refreshing Software Center and waiting for the notifications to roll in, and we'll just see what happens. Okay, so we see finally the download's done. And notice what we say here. Waiting for the next available maintenance schedule. Okay, so what that says is exactly what we've already talked about. We have a required deployment. It is not so important that we've decided to override the maintenance settings that are in place, but because there's maintenance settings in place, the required deployment's not going to run. But the next time a maintenance window opens up, it absolutely will. So that's exactly what you see. Okay, now we can see that in the logs. So this will be our first tour into the logs to take a look. In fact, let me just pull over here. So in our client log files, we start to see a good amount of information that helps us. So there's the first one we'll look at, maybe a little bit more cryptic than the second, but still descriptive. So service window manager log. So here, if we look at the time frame, and again, one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the logs is the timestamp is always your friend. So if you look at the log, then we will see that right around here the deployment started, and we'll see that we are looking for a service window with a runtime of 43,200 seconds. Okay, and we do have one, but it's going to be in the future. Now, this, you saw that I set the runtime on my maintenance window to 21 hours. I did that because my deployment was set to 720 minutes. That's really 12 hours, so I could have done a smaller maintenance window. But here's what you'll see. So if you have a smaller maintenance window that is in the future, you're not going to be told that you're going to run this in the future because there's no way this is ever going to run. Instead, you would see it be an error. In fact, in our next example, you're going to see the error condition that will show up in Software Center because there's never going to be a maintenance window that's big enough to accommodate running this deployment. In my case, I made sure my maintenance window was big enough to accommodate running my deployment, so I see a scenario where, yes, we're going to run it, but not yet. It's going to be in the future. Okay? So I see that in the log here, biggest active service window, program can't run. Okay? Now, again, that's a little bit cryptic, so let's go to a better log that may be a little bit better wording, or will be, to help us see what's going on. So if we scroll up in the CI, oops, looks like we rolled over here. Let's go to the older one. I'm looking at the wrong log. Sorry, CI agent is what I was on. I want CI task manager. So if we look at this log, then we're going to see right here, not enough admin defined service windows available, which again tells you we can't run this right now. Okay, we'll schedule it for the future and run it then. Okay, so that's the first demo. So I'm going to go ahead into the console and remove this deployment and set up another one in a minute. Okay, so for the second demo, I'm going to make an adjustment to my maintenance window. So while that's working its way through, let's go back to our collection and change the maintenance window. So if we go to properties on it, go back to maintenance window. Now what I want to do is remove this one, or I can just edit it and adjust it. So now I want to set this where we are currently open. I'll say none. Doesn't really matter what I put in here as long as what I have in here is realistic. So we are going to move back to where we're on the current day. So March 10. Okay. And what I want to make sure of is that my maintenance window is wide open, but not too wide open. So here, my client is actually 2 hours offset in a different time zone, just for some other testing I was doing. And I will set this so that it will have an open window right now. So say 5 o'clock p.m. to 3 o'clock. Or, 8 o'clock p.m. Okay, so that's good enough. So we have a 5-hour maintenance window. It is currently open. So I'm going to hit OK there. It's going to warn me I just have a single maintenance window. Yeah, that's fine. Hit OK. And so now this is going to work its way out to the client. And the client, through policies, should learn about this while I'm setting up another deployment. So for this deployment, I'm going to go back to the software library and add a new deployment. So this one will be very much the same as the one before. Remember, though, now we have the maximum runtime of 720 minutes. That will come into play. In fact, that 720 minutes, as I said, just did come into play, but it wasn't so in your face as being a problem because we had a maintenance window in the future that would accommodate it. This time you're going to see that it is for sure a problem if you don't have enough time in your maintenance window. Okay? So, and on that topic, really, while I'm clicking through here, in my case, in this case, we're going to actually see an error condition show up because we don't have enough time left in our maintenance window, or we don't have a maintenance window that's large enough to accommodate the deployment. In practice, you probably rarely will run into that scenario. The more likely scenario is that you don't have enough time left in your maintenance window to get all the work done that you want to do. This is a pretty extreme illustration of the fact that we will not run something if we don't have enough time left in the maintenance window. In practicality, you probably will get some things run. It's just you may not get enough run in that time frame. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh this. The client's already learned that deployment was taken away. So we will go back and refresh machine policy and all to get the maintenance window back down here, and then we'll watch what happens on the client side when that takes place, and we get our new deployment. Again, same application, reconfigured maintenance window, deployment pretty much the same, but we'll see a little bit of a different response this time. So we'll wait for that to show up. I'll do another policy cycle, and we'll wait for that to show up here in a bit and watch what happens. Okay, so we see that software changes are required. Let's refresh Software Center. We see installation failure. Okay, so the status, past due, will be retried. Okay, so we're going to sit here and we're going to retry this thing because you're saying it's required when you make this configuration. But if you look under the covers at our logs, there's no maintenance windows that are ever going to allow this to run. So if I go back into my logs directory, then we'll start again in the service window log, and it's going to be very similar to what we just saw. So here we're saying, hey, program cannot run. We don't have any time frame. Here we need a window that has 43,200 seconds in it, 720 minutes. Okay, it's a one-start service window, so there's only one of them. There's no service windows that are available that fit this criteria, and so we're not going to run. So again, if we go to CI Task Manager, we're going to see a little bit of a more friendly message. And basically, it's this. No service windows are defined to accommodate the execution of this thing. Okay, we don't have enough time. All right. And so we're good to go. So no current service windows with the time required. You see that specific entry right here. All right. So that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to show you on the service window side. Having the ability to set service windows very, very important for most environments today, so that you can control when things happen, particularly to servers, and when things don't. Knowing how to set them is the goal here of what I wanted to show you, and also understanding the quasi-service window side for the user. All right, so let's move into our next discussion, which is to look at the Distribute on Demand capabilities for Configuration Manager 2012. Okay, so for the next piece I want to demo is the concept of Distribute on Demand. So Distribute on Demand is really describing a scenario like the following. So say that you have an application. Maybe it's a very large application in terms of total size, and you want to make that application available to the various users in your environment. Maybe the full set of users, maybe a subset of users, whatever makes sense. But bottom line is, you don't know whether those users are actually going to want the application or not. You want to make it available for them if they need it, but since it's large, you don't want to have it on all of your distribution points proactively, just where it's needed. So Distribute on Demand allows you to configure an application that is available to the environment, but not on any distribution points yet. And when the application is requested, it rolls down to the distribution points at that time. So that's what we have for distribution on demand demo that you see highlighted here. So there are a couple of pieces that need to be in place first. So let's go look at those and we'll come back to the demo. So if I go to administration, first thing that I need to have is boundary groups with appropriate boundaries configured. So you see my boundary group for my primary site. If I go to properties on here, you will see my one boundary where my client currently is located, and also my one distribution point that currently has association in the boundary group. Another thing that is critically important is that the distribution points listed in the boundary group are not allowed as fallback locations for any other content. Okay, let me show you what I mean. So if I go to the distribution points for my one distribution point there, and look at the properties of that distribution point, then what I'm going to see is I have an option on my boundary group tab to specify whether or not this distribution point is enabled as a fallback location for content. Again, what is fallback? Fallback is that scenario where you have a client that is currently outside the boundaries that are defined in their location and needs content. Well, since they're not in a boundary group with their boundary, distribution points aren't necessarily available for them because of those settings. Again, I'll show you that in the roaming demo in a minute. So in order to get content in that scenario, which I'll show you in a minute, you would have to have a distribution point enabled to allow fallback, meaning allow client access to content whenever they're not within the boundaries. In this case, by definition, when you remove this box, you're saying this distribution point only serves clients that are in the boundary. Okay? Said another way, by removing this box so that this distribution point cannot support failover, you're turning this distribution point into what's known as a preferred distribution point. You're associating it with a boundary group. And by that association, when clients on that boundary request service, they know that this distribution point is preferred to them. Another SMS2 or Config Manager 2007 term that applies here too is the distribution point's protected. This distribution point cannot serve any device that's outside of the boundary group. Okay, not to belabor that point, but hopefully that makes sense. So in our case, we have this configured. It is not allowed as fallback. We have our boundary groups and our boundaries configured appropriately. So we're ready to look at our demo. So if I come over to our demo, then it's pretty easy. Just look at the properties of it, and we can see a couple of things. So first of all, we see that there is no distribution point defined for this right now at all. So whenever the client goes to run it, it's not going to have any place that it can go to get this. Okay, another thing to show you real quick and just to differentiate. So if we click on edit here, all right, and then if we go to the content tab, so here we see the third setting that's required to make sure distribute on demand is configured. So specifically, the application itself needs to be configured not to allow fallback. So let's review. There's three pieces that have to line up. The first is that your boundary and boundary groups have to be configured appropriately, and that your client be on a boundary that is controlled by that boundary group. Then secondly, the distribution points within that boundary group need to be configured not to allow fallback. And then thirdly, the application needs to be configured not to allow fallback. So the idea here is if you have a distribution point that is capable of fallback distributions, then very possibly that distribution point can have the content for those kind of scenarios. If where you're just not sure which clients in your organization may want to run this application. If you would prefer to use the distribute on demand mechanism, then avoid setting fallback capabilities for both your application and for your distribution points, as we talked about. Okay, so that said, let's go try to run this this deployment. So what you'll see is that we have this deployment here in Software Center from previous testing. It shows failed. There's actually another reason why it shows failed. I'll show you there in a minute. But just to show you, this deployment is currently not in the cache. So if I look at all these, I'll have several things that are repeated here. But if I look in here, you will find that none of these include the content necessary for this deployment. And the content necessary for this deployment will contain one file called test app. Okay? So it's not here. So when I go to run this, then just hit retry, then what's going to happen here is, well, depending on where I am, in my case it failed again. It failed because basically before I started going down this road, I ripped the content out of the cache. So that's the reason potentially for one failure in my case. I can't remember exactly where I am in the flow of this, so it may work the next time, it may not. But the bottom line is, whenever you run a deployment, let me go ahead and run it again. When you run a deployment that is configured for on-demand distribution, distribute on demand, yeah. So I only had one failure. Okay. So let me back up based on our scenario and explain this. So when you run content that is configured to deploy on demand or distribute on demand, the first time you attempt to run that content, it's going to fail because you don't have any distribution points that contains the content, right? So by triggering it the first time, you're essentially sending a message to the servers on the back end to say, I need this content, and then the content's automatically provisioned for you at that time. So once the content's provisioned, when you come back and retry the application, just like I did, it's going to then have the content and can download it and execute it. Okay, so now we see that we have test app that's been downloaded and is available, and it ran. Okay, now I wanted to use this opportunity to show you this setting. So you notice it still says failed. This is actually a bit of a misnomer here, but it illustrates why it's so important to have the detection rules defined in Configuration Manager. So let's go look at the logs for just a second. So if you look at the logs that track the deployment, you'll find one called app enforce. And if you look at this log, it tells you exactly what happened. It went through, it deployed test app, and it looks for an exit code of 0, meaning success. We got an exit code of 0, meaning success. But then the very last thing it does is it performs a detection using your detection rules that are configured on your app. In my case, mine are bogus, and they don't match anything. So because of that, we don't detect the applications installed, and so we roll it back over to a failure, even though it deployed successfully. So that was intentional just to illustrate that, but it does underscore why you need those deployment rules to be in place and to be accurate. All right, and so to finish up, if we go to Properties on the application, we will now see magically that we have a distribution point that has shown up because of our Distribute on Demand settings. All right, so for our third demo, we're going to turn the page and come over to roaming. Okay, so this will be a little bit tedious, and apologize for that. On the video, it'll actually go a little bit faster as I show you this, because I'm going to have to move things around a little bit. But here's the scenario. So this is the scenario right now where we have our client in our home site. So let's review the environment. This is what I showed you at the PowerPoint to start with. So our client currently is assigned to site PS1. So let's look at site PS1 for a minute. So PS1 is, we can do it all with boundary groups. So PS1 is right here. So by definition, this client's boundaries are right here, this one IP address, and we have one associated distribution point. Okay. PS2 is a second primary, and it has this IP address and this site server, or this distribution point. Then we have a secondary site, which is again a child of PS1, and it has this boundary and this one distribution point associated. Now, let's be clear. The client, throughout the demo that I'm going to show you, will never change site assignment. It will always be assigned to site PS1. The whole roaming demo, or the whole idea of roaming, is to illustrate, in the demo, is to illustrate how when the client moves around the infrastructure, the hierarchy, when it finds itself within the boundaries of a site that has local resources that it can use, it's going to use those local resources rather than traverse the WAN link. There's also accommodation for scenarios where the client is not within any defined boundary, and then it just talks to its home site. Again, we'll see all of that through the demos. So let's go back to our application, and I'll show you what we have. So first of all, for our roaming demo, we have the content deployed, as soon as I can get the properties, to all of our available distribution points. So regardless of where they are, every distribution point has the content deployed. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to show you real quick, if I go back to properties, to our deployment type, and edit, you'll notice that fallback is not allowed. Okay, so if a client is not in the boundaries of a defined boundary group and therefore distribution point, it's not going to have anywhere to go to get the content. Again, I'll show that to you. All right. So that said, let's go illustrate this on the client side. So let's and we'll do most of our work here on the client side now. So just to show you, I have this client currently on my .34 address, which is exactly in the boundaries of my primary site. All right, so what I see here is the general tab of my client control panel applet, and there's some interesting stuff I can learn here. So first I see who my currently assigned management point is, so it's my home management point, and it will remain to be throughout all of the demos that we do. Other thing I see is that I'm assigned to my site code. So nothing else really all that interesting here that I will call out for the roaming demo. All right, so let's go ahead and close this and go ahead and run our roaming demo app. So you see right now it's available. So you're not going to see anything from the user's experience that lets them know anything different is happening. But again, we're going to look at the logs, and this is the first time in this session today that we've really touched the logs, but I hope you're starting to get a feel already for how useful the logs can be. All right, so we're going to click install. And this may fail. I can't remember if I've actually downloaded this already or not. In fact, I know I haven't. So here it's going to run, right? So that's all well and good. Actually, let me get rid of that because it was already in the cache. I'm going to wipe that out again and make it re-download. So we have it. Let me uninstall it first. Okay, good enough. So let me get that out of the cache so we can watch the whole thing download. All right, so let's do it again. So I'm going to install this, and it's going to fail because I just ripped the cache out from under it, and then I'll do it again. Okay, retry. So now we should see it download. Downloading, and here it comes as quick as that. We run. Okay, so we needed to get that so I can show you the logs. Okay, again, because if it's in the cache, it's always going to run, no problem at all. So let's go back here and go to the logs. So if I navigate to the logs directory, Windows CCM logs, there's one in particular that's interesting here, and that's the Content Transfer Manager. So there's a lot of stuff that actually happened behind the scenes, which we'll cover in later sessions, but just to give you quick insight here, Content Transfer Manager here. Okay. So if I look at this, this log is responsible for going and retrieving, downloading the content. I can see exactly what happened right here. Okay. Basically, I'm needing this content information, and I went and downloaded it from my primary site's distribution point. Okay. Now, one thing to tie a couple of things together. You can't really tell the name of this by just looking at this log, but this ID will tell you exactly that. So if you tie this to the console, so this is DD4F, tie this to the console and look at our deployment type, you'll see I've added this column. It's not there by default, but you will see that this is the content ID that we just downloaded. So it absolutely is trackable back and forth. Okay, so easy enough. By just simply running this, I know that that I've pulled it down from the distribution point in my primary site, that's the boundaries that I'm within right now, so easy enough. So let me uninstall that, and then I'll rip it out of the cache again. Okay, so it's gone. Good enough. Rip it out of the cache, and let's make a change. So I'm going to go to the control panel, and go into network, and change my IP address to be a .41. Okay, IPv4, change it to .41. Good enough. So now what this is going to do is put the client directly within the boundaries of the secondary site. So it's still assigned to the primary. So to show you this quickly, I'm just going to go ahead and restart the client service. And you'll see Software Center closed. That's okay. It'll spin up again. Whenever the service starts, I'll relaunch it. And we'll continue. So the reason I'm doing this, I don't have to stop and restart the service for roaming to work. I don't want to leave that impression. The reason I'm doing this is because when I move boundaries, the client applet in the control panel will display new information. And it's useful information for understanding the client's relationship to its site. So you see I'm on boundary 41. So if I go and let's just relaunch Software Center. All right, and let's go back to the control panel main area and relaunch our Config Manager applet. Okay, so let's see if it's adjusted yet. So restarting the client service makes it adjust quickly, more quickly than normal, and it has. So notice here, I have my assigned management point is still the same. It hasn't changed. But I have two new entries. I have a resident management point, meaning now I'm within the boundaries of another management point. So I'm going to try to use that when I can for looking up content and so on. And also, it's a proxy management point. Same management point is listed as the proxy management point, which is only in place at a secondary site. So I'll list it there too. Okay, so very useful, very quickly to look at the control panel applet in the general tab. You can tell where the client thinks it is, and it's useful for troubleshooting. Okay, so I'm going to close this out because I'm going to have to make another adjustment in a minute. Let's go back to Software Center and refresh. We should have data showing up here right away, pretty quick. Okay, so I paused the recording while this showed back out. It just took a few minutes. So now I'm in the second scenario. Now I'm within the boundaries of my secondary site. I'm going to click Install again. I ripped the cache out from under it, so I expect that this time it'll fail. Now let me retry it, and we should go out and download the content. And again, to the user, it doesn't really make any difference, right? Because you're not going to be yanking the cache out from under the user as a general rule in production. So we're waiting to apply changes. We're going to go out. We're downloading the content now. So that should happen straight away. There we go. And we're installing. So same experience, even though the user's in different boundaries. The only way, or one of the ways we're going to tell, is by looking at the Content Transfer Manager log. And again, now we see it's the same content ID, the DD4F, but now we're pulling it from our secondary site server. So we can tell exactly where it came from is local versus going back to our home site. Okay, so let's make another change. So let's go back into Control Panel and go into Network and Sharing Center. I'm going to move it now within the boundaries of another primary site. Okay, now this other primary site is a peer to my home primary site. Remember, with Configuration Manager 2012, you can only have one level of primaries. So by definition, it's a peer, and that's fine. We'll be able to find what we need. So I'll move that to 42 and hit close. All right. And like before, just to speed things along, I'm going to restart the service. Okay, and wait for that for a second. Okay, good enough. So let's start it back up. And then shortly, the Control Panel Applet General tab will reflect our current location. So let's go back there. One more. Okay. May not be there yet, but let's see. And it is actually. So notice we're still in our assigned site. Now our proxy management point is gone because we're no longer in the boundaries of our secondary. Now we're in the boundaries of our primary, or not our primary, the peer primary, PS2. So this naming may be a little bit odd. It is the second primary. It's just a different server right here. So we know that we're now talking to the management point on our other server. Okay. So let's go and look at Software Center and execute this again. There it is. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and make sure this is cleared out from the cache. I don't think I remembered to delete it. So let's just go ahead and get all of it to make sure. All right. So now I have my roaming demo, and I'm going to, actually I need to uninstall it. So let me restore that to the cache real quick. One moment. There we go, temporarily while I uninstall. Then I'll remove it again. Okay, good enough. So let's yank it out of the cache, and we'll try to install it again. Install. And it failed, as we expect, and we're going to do it again. So by the way, interesting little factoid. If I didn't have the content in the cache when I was doing an uninstall, it would go back and get it again, just like I'm showing you here. I just didn't want to have to do that. So now we're going to go back to our Content Transfer Manager log and look at where we get it this time. And as you will expect, it's going to get the same content, but this time from the distribution point at the primary site number 2. Okay, so cool stuff. Pretty good to go. Now let's do the next scenario. Where we're going to change the IP address to be outside boundaries altogether. So let's go back to Network Sharing Center, Adapter Settings, go to Properties, and here we're going to just go ahead and change that back to, let's do 43. So IP address 43 is not managed by any of the boundary groups that I have in my lab. So by definition, it will be roaming, but roaming outside of any of my defined boundaries. So like before, I'm going to stop the service and restart it. And what you'll notice now when we get into the applet, the config manager applet, it will look just exactly like it did the first time, because the only option we have now is our primary site that owns us. Okay, so where we're assigned, there is no other boundary that we match. So the only place we can go for anything is our home site. So, but you're going to notice that this doesn't respond maybe like you think it will. Maybe it will, depending on what your expectations are. So let's go to the config manager general applet, and you'll see again no proxy management point, no resident management point, just like before. Okay, so good enough. Now let's go to Software Center. And I think I forgot to uninstall it last time, but I'll do that quickly and then see what happens. So roaming demo, let's uninstall. All right, good enough, so it's available. So let me rip it out of the cache. All right, and we're back to a place where we want to try to install. So let's go try to install. Okay. Install. And notice now it was going to fail first because it's not in the cache. Try it again. And this time it fails also. Okay. The reason for that, if you'll remember, I showed you on the application that the application is set to not allow roaming. Well, since I'm in a roaming configuration, I can't download the content. So therefore, I fail. Okay? Which brings us to the second deployment that I want to show you to kind of prove this out. So if I go back to my CAS, we have another deployment here called roaming demo fallback. All right, so this is exactly the same as it was, the previous one, except here I allow fallback. All right, and if you look at the properties here, on content, it is allowing fallback. Okay, if you look at the distribution points that I have configured on my demo, then the only distribution point that has this content is this one. Okay, so now based on the fact that I went and made some changes to my distribution point earlier to support distribute on demand, I need to make sure and go back and turn this back on to allow fallback. So let me go do that real quick and make sure this demo will work, and we'll continue. So let me go back to distribution points. And go to properties and go to the boundary group tab. Good enough. And now I'm going to allow fallback again. So easy as that. Okay. So now whenever I go run this deployment on the client side, this one should absolutely work. So let me go clear the cache again just to make sure, even though it's a separate deployment. Let's start with the same fresh slate. All right, it's already done. Fresh slate that we had for the first one, and we'll go try to run this one. All right, so I'm going to click install, and may get a failure the first time. We'll see. Since the cache is gone, yeah, failed. So let's try it again, retry, and we'll see what happens. So waiting to apply. Okay, so now it's downloading content. We're getting it from our fallback distribution point because of our settings, and we can show that by, again, looking in the Content Transfer Manager log, scrolling down a bit, and finding out where we got it. And in fact, it came from PS1. Again, it worked now because I allowed fallback. All right. So that kind of walks through the client-side demos that I wanted to do, again, addressing roaming, distribute on demand, and maintenance windows, pulling in a few other concepts, doing a first touch on the logs. For the next session, we'll be back on the server side, and we'll start pulling back the covers more on what happens on the server side as you build packages in the next session, as you build applications in another session after that, and continue on from there, ultimately arriving back on the client side and seeing some more on the logging side and WMI and different things that are involved behind the scenes. So we will see you then.